In passing to the history of the Church of Scotland, it is pleasant to remark in the outset that the general course of that history exhibits nothing so criminal and revolting as the enormities that have just been recited. This observation, however, does not apply to one dark period of Scottish history in which prelacy, in its rampant mood, rioted in Scotland like a wild beast broken loose from its barriers. Several circumstances conspire to render the history of the Scottish Church preeminently fitted to elucidate the question under discussion. First, because her history is better known to us than that of more distant churches. Secondly, because the experience of that church illustrates our question in a twofold aspect, both as regards the effect of an alliance with enlightened and pious rulers and of an alliance with rulers of an opposite character. Thirdly, on account of the preeminent advantages which that church possessed for withstanding the corrupting influence of a dangerous alliance. When we call to mind the unrivaled excellence of her formularies, the compactness and firmness of the Presbyterian church government, and the very moderate provision made for her ministers, the proverbial energy and sturdiness of the Scottish character, it must be admitted, we conceive, that if any church could bear the ordeal of such an alliance, the Church of Scotland might have done so. What, then, are the facts of the case in regard to this church? When we glance at the history of the Scottish Church after the Reformation from Popery, we observe in her diversified experience for a period of 30 years that the alliance of civil rulers may be either a distinguished blessing or a grievous curse to a church. During the greater part of that time the effective power of the civil government was in the nobles. Neither Mary of Guise nor Mary Queen of Scots was ever able to exercise the unfettered authority of a sovereign. The same remark applies to the early part of the reign of James, who was advanced to the throne at 12 years of age. It pleased the Most High to dispose a number of leading nobility to favor the Reformation, and by their instrumentality, the cause of true religion in Scotland was exceedingly promoted. But the Church was much afflicted by the vicissitudes which arose from the frequent change of the persons who administered the government. At one time the ministers were caressed, at another time harassed and persecuted. At one time episcopacy was overpowered and put down. In a short space the rulers had set it up again. At one time the church was permitted to manage her own affairs without much interference. At another time she was fettered and controlled by Erastian authority. Lay patronage kept its place in her during this entire period. Yet amidst all her struggles and conflicts, the cause of religion was greatly advanced throughout the kingdom in the time specified. During the next 40 years, from the time that James began to grasp the reins of government more firmly, the condition of the church was very much changed for the worse. The freedom of the General Assembly was completely destroyed. It was permitted to meet only at distant intervals, and immense pains were employed that nothing should be transacted in it but what was agreeable to the sovereign. The assembly itself was made the instrument by which the church was corrupted and degraded. Violence and cunning were employed, alternately, as the occasion required, until at length it was cajoled, bribed, or intimidated into compliance. The same system of policy was pursued by Charles. The son was indeed vastly inferior to the father in political sagacity, but what was wanting in intrigue and dexterous management he endeavored to compensate by violence and inflexible obstinacy. The power of the bishops was augmented. The High Commission Court was stimulated in its high-handed oppression. The Articles of Perth were rigorously enforced. The loudest declaimers in favor of Arminianism and superstitious ceremonies were patronized and promoted. All entrants to the ministry were bound by oath to submit to the bishops. At length the Book of Canons and a liturgy were prepared with a view of destroying every remaining vestige of Presbyterian Scotland. This proposal brought on the crisis which issued in the Second Reformation. On the whole, it would be a hazardous assertion that the Church of Scotland reaped advantage from her connection with the state for a period of 40 years from 1596. A process of direct and palpable corruption was successfully carried forth, which must soon have deprived her of all her preeminence, and have made her as formal, heretical, and servile as Laud or his master could have desired. Of the bearing of the Second Reformation on the point under discussion, we can afford to submit only the following observations. First, that Reformation was commenced and carried forward not by the assistance or with the concurrence of the existing civil rulers, but in spite of their most determined hostility and oppression. Had Charles possessed sufficient power to prevent it, The Reformation would certainly not have been accomplished under his reign. When the crisis occasioned by his own despotism drew on, he anxiously looked to Scotland for assistance in his struggle with the English Parliament, and knowing the supreme regard which the Scottish people had for their religion, he was disposed, in their existing emergency, to make every concession. A Parliament being therefore called under these favorable circumstances, the Jesuitical prince concurred with it in ratifying the leading and primary measures of the Reformation. Indubitable evidence was afterwards afforded that this was a mere stroke of policy, and that he was fully determined, as soon as he should be able, to overthrow and reverse everything he had now established. In the progress of the Civil War, the sovereign authority was laid under a sort of suspension in Scotland, as well as in England. From this cause, the party who were inimical to the Reformation were broken up and enfeebled. This party, to which the general name of malignants was commonly applied at that period, included a great variety of characters. Some were concealed papists, many were attached to prelacy, others were indifferent or opposed to all religion, skeptics or infidels. Many of them, as might be expected, were men of immoral and wicked lives. They were all supporters of the royal prerogative, the friends and abettors of arbitrary power. Had Charles possessed the sovereign authority unfettered, these were the men who would have been his conciliars and great officers of state, and it is absolutely certain that under their administration the Second Reformation could not have been effected. Secondly, the Reformers themselves labored strenuously to have the Church united to a reformed and Christian state. Every person who has given attention to the history of the period must have been struck with the astounding exertions they made to have the civil government constituted on scriptural principles and to place the administration in the hands of Christian men. They were deeply impressed with the conviction that in a reformed nation it was wrong in principle and dangerous to the interests of religion to invest the immoral and ungodly with power. They labored to exclude such persons both from the legislative and executive departments of government. In their covenants, they promise allegiance to the king only, quote, in the defense and preservation of the true religion, liberties, and laws of the kingdom, unquote. The importance they attached to this principle was farther demonstrated in those Acts of Parliament usually termed Acts of Classes, the design of which was to, quote, purge all judicatories and places of power and trust, and to endeavor that they might consist of and be filled with such men as were of known and good affection to the cause of God, and of the blameless and Christian conversation, unquote. This they regarded as a moral duty commanded in the Word of God, and of perpetual obligation. It is therefore manifest that the Reformers of this period acted steadily on the principle that the state, as well as the Church, should be constituted and regulated in conformity with the dictates of the Word of God, and therefore give no sanction to a union between the Church and an immoral or ungodly civil government. Thirdly, as soon as the power of the government came into the hands of irreligious men, the whole of the Second Reformation was overturned and abolished. The principles on which it was effected were declared by the Act of Parliament to be, quote, rebellious and treasonable, unquote, and the measures used for promoting it, quote, unlawful and seditious, unquote. Similar epithets were employed respecting the Reforming Assembly at Glasgow, and all its acts and decisions were pronounced, quote, null and void, unquote. All the meetings of Parliament during the Reforming period were condemned as without authority, and all their acts rescinded as testimonies of disloyalty, reproaches upon the kingdom, and unfit to be any longer on record. Thus all that could be done by government was done, to bury the attainments of the Reformation in oblivion, or to overwhelm them with everlasting disgrace. The public proceedings of the reforming parliaments were torn with indignation from the statute book, and the public proceedings of the reforming assemblies were torn from the records of the Church. No civil government since that time has ever proposed to replace the former, and no established church has ever seriously attempted to replace the latter. The new government, after the Revolution, never restored the authority of the laws of the reforming period, and the Revolution Church never restored the authority of the ecclesiastical proceedings of the reforming period. This may suffice to show the measure of respect entertained for the principles and attainments of the Second Reformation by an irreligious civil government and by the churches that are united with it. I am in a great measure relieved from the necessity of expounding the lessons of experience on this subject exhibited in the history of the Church of Scotland since the Revolution. The instruction which may be derived from that source has of late been frequently and forcibly presented to the public mind, and although it has been adduced for a very different purpose, it is not the less available for the illustration of the great principle of this lecture. Whatever evidence has been presented of the dismal effects of patronage in Scotland for 100 years, of the indolence and inefficiency and unsoundness in the faith and political subserviency of a multitude of her ministers during the ascendancy of moderatism, the whole of this serves to prove the pernicious tendency and mischievous effects of an alliance between the Church and an irreligious government. I shall not presume to travel over the ground that has been so ably occupied by a preceding lecturer in this course, by pointing out the palpable defects and blemishes of the ecclesiastical settlement at the Revolution, but content myself with remarking that these defects must, to a very large extent, be ascribed to this single cause, that the Church accepted of an improper alliance. Whatever exceptions may be justly taken to a number of the ministers admitted into the First Assembly after the Revolution, it is a matter of certainty that a majority of them submitted with great reluctance to the Erastian interferences of the civil rulers, and that the Assembly, had it been free and unfettered, would have constructed an ecclesiastical edifice much more in accordance with the model of the Second Reformation than that which was actually set up.